All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Curebase webinar on how to run clinical trials of digital therapeutics. This is our fourth webinar, actually, in a series that focuses on decentralized clinical trials. We started the series at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic because the tools and methods of decentralized research, which are actually our specialization here at Curebase, are really more important now than ever with so much of site activity and on-site research coming to a bit of a standstill. Feel free to check out our other educational webinars if you want on our website. We've had guests talk with us about quality and oversight in decentralized research, IRB perspective, and other cool topics like decentralized endpoint collection. This is actually our first webinar with DTX, so we're super happy to have this opportunity to chat today. Digital therapy trials and decentralized research are really natural partners, and we've had the opportunity to actually operate at Curebase many digital therapy trials so far using our tools, including with some of the panelists that are joining us as expert guests today. So really excited to have the opportunity to share our collective insights. Before diving in, I'll provide just a really brief overview of the format for the conversation today. To start, I'll summarize what's really unique and different about decentralized clinical trials and digital therapy clinical trials. So just a brief overview of what makes them different and what you need to be considering when planning a study and how it might be different than a drug study. After that, we'll dive into the guest panel. So we're going to be hearing from our expert guests and really focusing on the group conversation with them about their experiences and lesson learned in the studies that they've operated. During that time, we're also going to enable the audience Q&A. So please start thinking about great questions that you can ask right now. Great. So let's start by introducing our panelists. Our first guest is Yusuf Sherwani, who's the CEO and founder at QuitGenius. So Yusuf, if you do a quick introduction about yourself.
Sure, thanks, Tom. So my background is on the clinical side of healthcare, so qualified as a medical doctor over in the UK. Spent a lot of time during my training working in research, and specifically looking at how technology can really help people reduce many of the barriers that they face when it comes to accessing care and addiction. And, you know, unfortunately, we live in a kind of day and age where the toolkit for many of the stigmatized kind of conditions across behavioral health and addiction hasn't evolved at all in decades. And the challenge of addiction has only really increased over time. So, you know, in a nutshell, really, QuitGenius is a technology-enabled virtual clinic that really focuses on removing a lot of the barriers to people accessing and then engaging with addiction care to have better outcomes overall. So, yeah, really excited to be talking over here. You know, other thing I'll add is we use Curebase for the randomized control trial that we conducted for our tobacco cessation program. And, you know, I'm sure we'll kind of discuss many of the questions, but had some really great learnings over there.
Thanks, Yusuf. We also have Brian Harris, who's the co-founder and CEO at MedRhythms. Brian, could you give a quick intro?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom. I'm Brian Harris, the co-founder and CEO of MedRhythms. I'm a board-certified music therapist by training. I have advanced training in the neuroscience of music and how that can be clinically applied. And at MedRhythms, we're a digital therapeutics company that's going through the FDA route, building evidence-based interventions that use sensors and software and music to measure and improve walking. Currently, we're in the midst of our pivotal trial for the stroke population. We have a pipeline of products across neuroinjury and disease, including MS, Parkinson's disease, aging, and stroke. So we're in the midst of our pivotal trial currently for the FDA, and then we have a pipeline of also additional clinical trials coming up for the fall.
Amazing. Next, we have James. So James Lee is the co-founder and CEO at Mighty Health. So James, if you do a quick introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, thank you so much for having us on this panel with you. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Mighty Health. We are a digital coaching platform for health and wellness for people aged over 50. So as we've seen a ton of home fitness, wellness, nutrition exploding during the COVID pandemic, but the largely over 50 population has been largely ignored. So that's what we're targeting. And we had the honor of working with Tom and his team on our feasibility trial earlier this year.
Great. And my name's Tom Lundberg. I'll be the moderator here today. I'm the CEO and founder at Curebase. At Curebase, we run decentralized clinical trials. So to give a little context on that, typical clinical trials traditionally take place mostly on-site, but our approach is to run clinical trials that bring the participation to the patient and emphasize things like at-home participation in the trials, telemedicine, and the use of ancillary healthcare providers like mobile phlebotomists, telemedicine doctors, and local primary care providers. That's all powered by a purpose-built software platform that we've created, which includes things like ePro, eConsent, and other features that are really tailored for decentralized research. And we've also been the lead CRO operating digital therapy trials for a few different customers, including some pivotal studies that are for FDA submission. And in total, we've enrolled over 1,000 patients and managed them in digital therapy trials. Cool. So before the panel discussion, just a brief context setting. So we'll talk a little bit for this group about what a traditional clinical trial looks like, not necessarily a digital therapy trial, and use sort of an oral medication as an example, just to look at what the reference point is. So when you run a traditional clinical trial, you usually start with site selection. You'll pick a set of sites based on your recruitment needs, the population you need to reach. For example, if you need to reach 500 patients, you might select 5 to 15 different sites, and those providers would then recruit from their population, each with a principal investigator and research coordinators to support them on site. These patients would then present at those research sites for a baseline visit where a variety of activities would be performed. So these would include things like the standard clinical research processes like informed consent, verifying the patient's eligibility to participate in the trial, collecting things like labs and images that would be relevant to get a baseline of the patient, and then randomizing them into one or more treatment groups. The patients would then return home. They would take the oral medication regularly for some number of months, and they would likely come back into the site on a recurring basis, perhaps monthly, to have more labs, more imaging, and more data collected as part of the study. Digital therapy trials tend to be quite different, so I want to underscore some of the different things that we need to be thinking about. First of all, the on-site participation and that component of the study is usually less significant than it would be in a drug study. Having patients come in, every time they need some data collected is not necessarily going to make sense for studies of digital products. Additionally, patient engagement is usually a very, very important key necessity to the success of a digital therapy study. If it's an oral drug study, so long as the patient is taking the drug and presents for their follow-up visits, then the data will typically be usable. But if it's a digital product, a digital therapy, the patient really needs to want to get medical value out of that product. They need to be engaged if you're going to get the data and the results that you want for your submission. Additionally, digital endpoints are usually much more relevant and useful in these digital therapy clinical trials because the products themselves are digital. Things like usage metrics, usability, connected devices, biometrics, the actual data generated from your device can be extremely important and can be included in your data analysis. And finally, things like randomization and blinding can also present new challenges. Oral meds, it's pretty clear what a placebo is, but with something like a digital therapy, questions of what is a way of blinding and what constitutes a placebo for an app or take-home device is something that needs to be thought of in a lot of detail. Additionally, there's a lot more paths when you're doing a digital therapeutic trial. Businesses don't necessarily fit into narrow categories, and a lot of digital companies are actually pursuing new business models, combining products, services, online clinics, et cetera. So you need to think about the right audience. Is it for regulatory submission? Is it for publication? Is it for insurance? And you need to incorporate the strategy into your research planning in a way that's very different than in the drug world. And one more thing that I want to call out, which is a really amazing opportunity when considering digital therapy research, and this is also a key area of focus for Curebase, is that it's often a really good fit for decentralized clinical research techniques. So for the sake of definition, decentralized clinical trials, or DCTs, are really clinical trials that push the participation as much as possible away from the traditional research on-site visit and into the most convenient setting for the patient. So for example, the patient's home or a context that's convenient to them. These trials tend to, in order to do that, leverage technology tools, things like direct-to-patient recruiting through social media, remote electronic informed consent, collecting self-reported survey outcomes at home, things like pain scales, sleep scales, et cetera, and also things like biometrics, home blood draws, and other techniques of that type, usually powered by some form of virtual software technology to make it feasible. And the impact is that you can reach in these designs a lot more patients, a lot more efficiently, and you see benefits for things like patient diversity, the speed of the recruitment, often cost savings, and finally, robustness against COVID-19, because right now, if you don't need to bring patients in for anything that's not essential, you probably shouldn't. So a ton of advantages here. That's not to say that this is the only fit for all trials. Every clinical trial is different. Many will have on-site procedures that are essential. Many will require on-site engagement or a direct relationship with the principal investigator. So in our experience, there's often a mixed approach, which is called a hybrid trial. So decentralized trial is bringing the whole study to the patient at home. A hybrid trial would often involve perhaps an on-site engagement with the principal investigator, but also a combination, maybe pushing 80 to 90% of the activities at home for the recruitment, diversity, and other advantages of the approach. Awesome. So now that we've set the context a little bit, we're going to dive into the audience panel. This is the time when we're going to turn on the audience Q&A. So please start asking questions. It should be enabled within the next 30 seconds or 60 seconds or so. But we're going to dive into our panel discussion, and we'll pick up questions as you present them to us. So thanks. Cool. So while the questions are coming in, I'm going to start with panel introducing when you should run a clinical trial. So, in the drug world, it's pretty clear that you often are required at certain stages of your development to operate clinical trials. In digital therapy, it's often more of a strategic decision. So I guess whoever would like to go first, when did you decide that you needed to run a clinical trial in the first place, and what were the considerations you took?
I can jump in on the Quit Genius side. So I think there could be kind of varying reasons to run a clinical trial. Maybe compared to some of the people going through FDA submission processes where it's a regulatory requirement. At Quit Genius, we actually took a different view for our tobacco and vaping cessation programs. So those programs were being sold. We were selling them B2B to payers. And while it wasn't actually necessary from a regulatory standpoint, because kind of tobacco is seen as a behavior, what we did find was that it really gave us an edge against the competition to have the only kind of validated digital program with a randomized controlled trial behind it. Now, kind of doing RCT purely as a marketing stunt can be quite costly, of course, but there's definitely a cost-benefit analysis of if it can really help you stand out, against the crowd and really validate your results, and then kind of go to payers as well, who might not be as innovative and not require kind of trial results in order to actually be successful in commercializing it, then it does kind of make a ton of sense. So I would say that there is an entire category of reasons that are outside of regulatory requirements where it might help you stand apart from other competitors in the space who don't have the same level of clinical validation. And we've actually found it to be incredibly helpful for us to win national strategic partnerships with kind of major payers in the US.
And were you, Brian, James, if you have your own experiences, that'd be great to hear about when you decided to run a clinical trial.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective at MedRhythms, and I appreciate Youssef's perspective there, it certainly is a differentiator, having the level of clinical validation early on. I mean, for MedRhythms, we from day one said we were going to go the FDA regulated route with claims. It was important for us to want to make claims on product. And so we knew as soon as we started the company that the clinical trial route was the way to go. And for us, it was, when did we feel that the intervention was ready to be tested in clinical trial? And we did that sort of as soon as we could. And I think that, depending on where you sit in sort of the timeline of your own company, as Youssef said, of what is the goal now, who is the audience now, I'm under the approach that clinical evidence is important in any stage of a process. If we're in healthcare, we should have some clinical evidence behind our products regardless. But when and how and what those trials look like, I think is the much more strategic question.
Great.
Yeah, just to echo that as well, I think strategic is the perfect word to describe that. I think ultimately it's up to us to decide, what we're aiming for here. And for us at Mighty Health, we have been kind of a little bit back and forth on whether or not we want to go the FDA route, but ultimately our customer is going to be insurance companies and payers, as Brian just mentioned, and Youssef. And so with payers, on one hand, we're seeing explosion in terms of digital health companies and digital therapeutics. But what that means is that the marketplace is more competitive than ever. And the way to really stand out is to be able to show that you have really taken the diligence to be able to find the outcomes results from your digital therapeutic. And that really helps set you a bar above the rest. And that was the reason why we wanted to do ours.
And have any of you chosen to pursue any strategies in parallel? Often companies will market their products and simultaneously pursue levels of clinical validation that they can then present to differentiate or present to payers. Brian, it sounds like you have likely chosen not to market your product. I'm curious, what's the consideration about focusing on a particular pathway, closing down others, or can you have it all?
Yeah. From our perspective, as you mentioned, we have not sort of considered. I guess we considered at the beginning, but that was more of a commercial question of the company we wanted to be. Did we want to go the more consumer route first, and then turn on the clinical evidence later, or do them in parallel? And for us, we felt both from a sort of who we wanted to be as an organization, of making claims about the product from day one was important for a number of reasons. But also, as we think about commercially, we felt that there was a lot of value in demonstrating efficacy and demonstrating health economic value of our product before trying to go direct to consumer, direct to market without that evidence. We are, pursuing third-party reimbursement as well, and so that was an important bridge for us to cross before we tried to go to market, and that's why we decided to go this way.
Great.
Yeah,
and I would imagine. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
so yeah, one thing I'll add as well is, I guess, clinical trials can be a wide spectrum, from a randomized controlled trial to maybe a longitudinal study with a single treatment arm. So kind of going down the RCT route from the start may not necessarily be the thing that makes the most amount of sense. To Brian's point earlier, you need to have a high degree of confidence that your product actually works, before you then put it in an RCT where you can't actually change anything around the product itself. So we actually ended up publishing 6 peer-reviewed studies that were much more kind of small-scale pilot-based studies that didn't have the necessarily the same level of clinical validation as an RCT, but gave us a great deal of confidence and also enabled us to improve the product along that journey to the point that we felt we could put it in an RCT and have fantastic results, and that's inevitably what happened. And as we build other products in our pipeline and launch them, we're not necessarily going straight down the RCT route from the start. We've been doing much kind of smaller scale pilot studies that in and of themselves generate very valuable data sets that you can then kind of apply, make changes on before you then put it through an RCT.
Absolutely. And I think cost is a big part of that as well. Actually, I'm looking at the audience Q&A right now, and the number one question is about cost, which I think in digital therapy world is often a very relevant topic. We know for a fact that oftentimes a digital therapy company will come to a traditional clinical trial, get a traditional quote from perhaps a CRO or academic, and it won't quite make sense for what the realities of the study are and what the budget of the company is. But the question is from Chris. He asks, how expensive are decentralized virtual trials versus traditional trials with clinicians? So for example, if you have 500 patients, does one cost 1 million? The other costs 10 million. I'll answer very briefly first and then pass it back to the group. But we have driven significant cost savings on decentralized clinical trials over traditional models. Again, many of our customers have gotten competitive bids from other more traditional providers. And a lot of the cost savings usually comes from less site engagement. So, every time you bring a patient in to see a principal investigator in person, utilizing that physician's time, it does add up, and it is a costly visit. Additionally, when you do an on-site study, you often have to activate many different sites. That could be, those startup costs could be quite significant. They could take months to pursue those activation processes, contracting, budgeting, et cetera. So the cost of maintaining those sites does become quite significant. And as a result of our decentralized approaches, it's hard to put an exact number on it, but certainly the cost savings are significant. Brian, Yusuf, I know you both have sort of straddled this line a little bit, incorporating some study elements that are more traditionally on site, others that are more direct to patient. I'd be curious to know where costs fit into that equation.
So for us, the cost difference from doing an in-person trial with a traditional CRO and then doing a decentralized trial, which was somewhat hybrid because there was one in-person visit and then everything else was decentralized, was about kind of 20% of the cost. So there was an 80% saving, which is fairly substantial as well because we were reasonably early in our kind of journey. And even that 20% was a very significant outlay and like a big line item on our P&L, but we felt that we got really good value from it in the kind of clinical validation that we were able to generate on the back of that. But I would say if it cost us what it we wouldn't have been able to do a randomized controlled trial when we did it if we paid the full cost going with a traditional CRO and having everything done, in person using the old-fashioned kind of pen and paper method. And we got a number of quotes from US, European, and academic institutions just around like what that could potentially look like.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question. I mean, from my perspective, I don't have a great perspective specifically on cost. Many of our early trials were actually done in clinic, sort of purposefully, and we're sort of just coming up on some of our more digital and remote trials. But I think this brings up an interesting point too about how the interventions work and where the interventions fit. Also because part of this decision and the strategy about when and how also depends on what type of trial that you want to do. For us, from our perspective, at the very beginning, we decided to do in-person trials, in-clinic trials with our digital therapeutic because we wanted to limit confounding variables. We wanted it to look more like a traditional trial for the case that we were trying to make, and we wanted to see, sort of understand the pure effects of the intervention. Depending, and I'll remind folks that we're in a very sort of specific, looking to improve walking speed and walking biomechanics in neurology. And so, there's a very specific outcome that perhaps is best captured in a clinic setting. And so there's also, I think, a case to be made for making a decision whether or not to do it in clinic or not, which is in addition to cost and ease of deploying the trial as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something real quick to this too. So prior to working on a decentralized trial, we had gotten a number of quotes from a number of academic medical centers across the US on how much it would cost to do a 50 to 100 person feasibility study with them. And the quotes that we got range from, $350K to $500K for a 2-year trial. And so that's obviously a huge chunk of money for an early stage company that is, in your seed stage, and you're trying to make sure that your product is working and you're navigating your company in the right way. And it's not just that, but it was also a huge time commitment as well, because they said, if we're going to follow the formal process of working with the AMC, it's not just the cost of actually that they quoted us, the 350 to 500, which includes the administrative overhead for the academic medical center to run the trial, but also it's the cost of the monthly burn for us as a company as well to be able to support that trial, right? So the fact that we're able to do a decentralized trial at about a third of that cost, I would say it was about a 70% cost savings for us, made a huge difference, not just on the actual study cost itself, but the time and the bandwidth of our team to be able to run that at the speed that we want to run it at.
Yeah, absolutely. It's often overlooked that, it's not just about the cost of the trial. If the trial endures for a year longer than it needs to, that's time that you're not making progress. That's time that your internal resources are allocated on the project and that you're not moving closer to the commercialization. Okay, so one question that has been asked right now, which I think is a good fit, is what is the difference between a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trial, and how does it relate to digital therapeutics? So thank you, Kirtika. I think that I'd love to hear from the group sort of where this fits into the conventional layout of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and what some of the pathways for the digital therapy trials are.
I'll chime in first here. I think from our perspective, building through the FDA pipeline here of building and generating evidence for our digital therapeutic. I mean, we've looked at our trials as being, early feasibility phase 1, pivotal trial phase 2, real world evidence post-launch, it's sort of phase 3 trials and how we think about that. I think that those are corollaries because that's the language that's used in clinical trial development often. I think there's a lot of debate to be had about the exact phases of phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 as it relates to digital therapeutics. I know for us, that's sort of how we have looked at it is, early is phase 1 feasibility, no control group. Phase 2 is the pivotal trial as we think about, a larger scale efficacy trial. And then phase 3 being more of a real world evidence type study.
And for clarity, that's sort of just a mapping of the conceptual framework. That's not, if you were going down an FDA submission pathway, they would use different terms and it would probably go into a different office, correct?
Correct. I mean, that's, I think, as you said, a conceptual framework of sort of how to think about the corollaries here. And if you're going through the FDA, you know, there's processes by which you work with the FDA to understand evidence needed at each one of those stages for approval and, you know, et cetera. So that is a different conversation.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead to some of the questions around study design. So I think that one question that's been asked and gotten a lot of upvotes is around how to actually structure the study design with respect to how are we randomizing, what is considered a control group, and how do you really set up a double-blind trial in the first place for a digital therapeutic product where, of course, it's not as simple as a sugar pill.
So I could probably jump in and add a bit of commentary over here. I would say that people probably rush the study design phase, but it's kind of so important, and whatever you design is going to be with you through the duration of the trial all the way through to publication and beyond that as well. And it's not something you can kind of take a sort of iterative approach and change, you know, over time as well. So you know, really thinking about your different kind of intervention and control groups. And you know, the thing over here as well is it's not just about trying to, like, the goal isn't to try and show the biggest effect size necessarily. Like, it might be that you're trying to show non-inferiority against, like, you know, the current status of care, like what people would typically be using as an analog for your treatment as well. Another thing to kind of bear in mind as well is that usually when you're at the point of submitting your data to a peer-reviewed journal, they're going to really question why you chose those endpoints and why you chose that specific study design, and if they think that's valid as well. So kind of rushing this, you know, this stage doesn't make sense, because everything seems to be like thrown into question a little bit further down the line. You might be speaking to a payer after you've done this wondrous clinical trial where you found like a great effect size, and then they question, well, actually, those primary endpoints aren't in keeping with what we look for when we're looking for an intervention in this space, for instance, or you know, we would be really interested in how your program compares to what is actually currently used in the market as a control group, for instance. So I think for that reason, as much as possible, you don't want to develop the study design in a silo. You want to really kind of get buy-in from, you know, other customer groups that you're going to be interacting with, whether that's payers, FDA, etc. And ask them to critique and validate the study design, and then having independent academic experts, whether that's through like a scientific advisory panel or something, really critiquing it. And it's going to be an iterative process at that stage, but then you'll feel a lot more comfortable with, you know, the final study design that you have in place, and you won't need to do things like kind of file an amendment, change things around, etc. So I get that people are often very impatient to start these studies, because you're looking at things from a timeline perspective of, you know, we're going to have to do all this recruitment, then, like, you know, by the time we've collected all the data, submitted it to kind of FDA journal, whatever, there's going to be a lot of time that has elapsed. But you just don't want to get this kind of wrong, and you want to involve experts who really understand this, and also understand like the study design. Like, there's no absolutes over here. It really just depends on your product, what you're trying to get out of the trial, who you're going to be sharing the data with, and things like that. So kind of and questioning, do you even want a randomized controlled trial? Would a single arm longitudinal study, for instance, work equally well? Which in many cases does, and I've seen it scale very well.
Brian, James, could you share a little bit about how you set up your randomization and how you ensured the blinding, and if you did get feedback from either insurance company, self-insured employer, FDA, how that went about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what Yusuf said was correct. I mean, totally, you want to make sure that you're talking to your end customer, because again, there's a reason why you're running this trial. You know, obviously you want to know about the efficacy of your own product, but ultimately, you know, this also will help a ton in commercialization. And so you want to pick endpoints in a design that makes sense for them, that's convincing to them. You don't want to go through the effort of going through 1.5 years of a trial and then be able to show, you know, a white paper that doesn't meet those qualifications. So I think that's really important. We did talk to payers about what they would be looking for. In terms of the actual design of the trial and the control group, In our case, we were particularly trying to see if our intervention would work on cardiovascular patients after being discharged from the hospital from an acute event. And so, the standard of care there's two, potential sort of standard of care to compare against. One is cardiac in clinic cardiac rehab, which there's plenty of literature online about what kind of impact that would have. And then the second one, which is what 80% of folks do, which is they just go home and they don't participate in any program at all. Or perhaps that they have some material that's handed to them as part of their discharge packet from the hospital or from the cardiologist. And so in terms of running our RCT, we would, what we did was we put the control group was the folks that would be using that discharge packet essentially as their standard of care, and then using Mighty Health as the intervention. And that's how we designed it.
Yeah, and I like Issa's point of don't make these decisions sort of in a vacuum or in isolation, because there's so many strategic points about how you design your trial, both commercially for the end users, for the people who may prescribe it someday, for the FDA, et cetera. And you want to get particularly as startup organizations or smaller organizations, time and money are your greatest assets, right? So you want to make sure that you get the biggest bang for your buck as you're going to be spending money and time on a clinical trial. And as we thought about our early clinical trials as well, typically in rehabilitation, the control groups are always standard of care. So whatever your intervention is versus standard of care. What got interesting was if you look at where we are in the chronic stroke population, for example, our flagship product, there is no standard of care actually in chronic stroke. And so then the question becomes, well, how do we set up a control group? And I also will keep in mind, depending on the route that you're going as an organization, while randomized control trials, sort of are the gold standard, that might not always be appropriate or necessary for the endpoints that you need or for the goals that you're trying to achieve. So keep that in mind. And as we think about our control group, that was a process that we, first and foremost, this is a pivotal trial for FDA. And so we actually worked with FDA through the pre-submission process to help understand what would be a meaningful control group for the pivotal trial and also study design, et cetera. Obviously, number one, it's got to be statistically appropriate and valid that way if you're going to do a clinical trial. But I would say, think creatively about study design, about what works for you, what you're trying to actually show. And then I think the questioning about shams, placebos, blinding, that's really challenging in digital therapeutics or digital products. And there's no doubt about that. And I think there's a number of ways to think about that. However, when you think about placebos for digital trials, that really is product specific. For our example, we're using music to help people improve walking. So we're using music to directly stimulate the motor system to improve walking. And so how do you placebo music, right? So this is a very interesting question that I would say for efficacy claims, maybe we don't need to do that. For broader claims or for broader adoption, we may need to figure that out. And so we have scientific advisory boards in each of our disease states that can give us feedback on these trial designs, and then working collaboratively with the agencies that we're trying to, sort of build this data for.
Absolutely. Totally agree that you should use the right level of blinding and randomization, depending on the stage of study. I think especially for feasibility, it's often tempting to try and do a lot or to optimize for doing as rigorous of a study as possible. But every additional level of rigor does add complexity, and based on the stage of your study, the product maturity, and the budget, you want to make sure you're taking the right level of rigor. When you do go eventually through the FDA process, as Brian mentioned, get feedback as part of the pre-submission process. The blinding recommendation will often be something that's included. So, that will be done collaboratively, and you may well need to do the double-blinded approach. That's a pretty typical outcome when you do go down the full pivotal FDA route. And it is quite challenging. So it's really good to hear some of the approaches that you're all taking to make sure that blind is not broken. Another question that's coming up is about engagement, which is actually somewhat related. As part of maintaining the blind, you need to make sure that patients are not accidentally learning about which group they're in, but you also need to reach out to them, and you need to communicate with them to make sure and monitor them to make sure that they are having some level of engagement with your product, because ultimately many of these products are behavioral. So I guess for the panel, I'll ask, have you taken any specific measures? And this question comes from Niels. Have you taken any specific measures to either monitor the level of user engagement? Have you taken any efforts to make sure that the most engaged patients are the ones who are allowed to participate? And how has that been included in your protocols?
So just to clarify, is that engagement with the actual program itself, or like kind of retention into the trial you're referring to, or kind of selection criteria to make sure that people don't drop off or some combination?
So if your study involves sort of a daily survey reported endpoint, or a commonly or a frequent endpoint that needs to be reported, self-reported by the patient, or it requires a biometric device that needs to be consistently used, that is one part of the question. How do you make sure that you're enrolling patients and that they understand how to use those devices, how to submit that data, and that they're doing so effectively? A second part would be, how do you ensure that they're using your behavioral product and that you're able to measure the level of engagement with the actual digital therapeutic itself? So related, but yes, there are slightly different questions.
So on the latter question, I think it's really more of a product challenge that you have as you're building these technology products. You have to constantly be measuring cohort retention and making sure that you have an engaging product. The clinical trial is really going to test that, because if people are engaged to the same level as they are in the control, then clearly you have a lot of drop-off, and you're not really kind of, it's less likely you're going to have that kind of behavioral change. So I think that's more just like, how do you build engagement with the product? And there's a challenge people face, and there are great strategies for doing it, but it's going to be very product specific. In terms of if there's a specific endpoint that you're trying to actually measure and you want to make sure people are filling in kind of study, people are motivated to really participate in the study and filling in feedback forms and kind of the questionnaire. It's always a challenge in every study, like maintaining retention. You'd probably want to power the study to expect some kind of drop-off. You'd want to look at what the drop-off and retention looks like by analogous studies. We know in tobacco and vaping cessation, for instance, that people who drop off are often because they haven't been successful in actually quitting smoking in the first place. So an intention to treat type analysis will really suss that out, because you just assume that if they didn't respond, they're not going to necessarily have been successful with the program. To some extent, you need to really benchmark this against like analogous studies. And then there are lots of strategies that you can actually take advantage of to ensure that you're recruiting people into your study who are interested in participating in that study and being a part of that study. And I think this is actually something that is probably kind of like underappreciated. We did a bit of this, but I know kind of Curebase excel at this in general. Like one of the things you can do is actually so the reason we took a hybrid approach of requiring an in-person visit is because we knew that people willing to go in person and actually have that baseline visit are likely going to be interested in the study. When you're advertising for participants to participate in the study, you never really want to focus and talk about the monetary value they get from being as part of the study, because then they do it for the wrong reasons. You want to talk more about advancing research and whatever actual kind of treatment you're providing, or whatever condition you're trying to kind of target, without necessarily giving them any information about what's in the control group or what's in the intervention group. Something else that we did, which we found very effective, was regular newsletters. So we sent, I think there was a quarterly or maybe a monthly newsletter to all participants in the study, irrespective of whether you're in treatment control. Just a bit more around how the study, like a reminder, by the way, you're in the study. A lot of people forget that they ever signed up to study in the first place. And then like how it's going, how they're advancing research, kind of a good warm, fuzzy feeling. You have to be very careful to make sure that they don't kind of give away whether, if it's a blinded study, whether they're in treatment or control or anything like that. But there are lots of different ways you can use to ensure that people are primed to collect that, to fill in like the forms you have at the end. And then you're also going to some extent, be prioritizing between your primary endpoint and your secondary endpoints. So primary endpoints is where you definitely want to have data like one way or another. So the way the Curebase system was designed is, even if we got incomplete data because somebody got bored halfway through filling in like the survey forms, we still got, like, we recorded that in incomplete data and we got the primary endpoint first. So we're asking the important questions first, and then kind of however far you get along in all the other questions that you find in like clinical studies, you get there. So lots of specific strategies that can be done. And I'm sure Curebase kind of have like a playbook of things they do. But before I even kind of get there, I would strongly encourage you to be very confident that your intervention itself, if it's behavioral, has good engagement, because a clinical study is really going to show whether or not it does. And if it doesn't, then it's kind of, I wouldn't say wasted, because negative results are always good for research, but maybe purely from a commercial standpoint, you don't really want to be in that kind of situation necessarily, which could have been entirely avoided if you were doing a study at a point in time at which you were confident that your program worked and was engaging.
Brian, James, any experience or lessons on the engagement side?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is such a big topic because so many of the other digital therapeutics companies we talk to, and even the buyers, the payers, and the employers who are purchasing these digital therapeutics say that, you've got the one slide that shows all the incredible outcomes from a clinical efficacy perspective. And then you've got like sort of the dirty secret that like the enrollment and the engagement on that is actually quite low. And so, they're reporting on a very, very small slice of their members. So being able to show that is incredibly important. I think our biggest learning around this has just been really trying to find a balance between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, basically what Yusuf said, right? So, we have all the qualifying surveys, and we also have, the requirement to have a baseline visit as well. So that way, if you're just there for the money and perhaps you're even lying about your conditions, you probably don't want to go sit in front of a doctor and talk about your medical history if that's the case. And so we have, hoops to jump through basically like that. But on the other hand, we also found that there are, still going to be sort of what we call like professional research participants, right? So these folks who see like a dollar amount and are overly excited to be a part of your study because of the dollar amount. And there were some even elements where we found that, increasing the amount of money that we were offering as part of the incentive to participate actually decreased engagement, because the quality of the type of patients that we were bringing into the study, began to shift based off that dynamic. So, similar to what was already said, but basically those are some of the elements that we looked at in terms of keeping people engaged, was making sure there's a balance between our product keeping them engaged and the fact that they're actually benefiting from it versus, some weekly payout to be able to report results. I think both are great. Having a hybrid model is important, but knowing where to balance balance those two is really important.
And I'll just add, I think James and Yusuf have a better perspective, sort of on this question as it relates to, remote trials. Our trials, largely thus far, we've done, working on some smaller trials that are remote, but most of the trials are done in clinic. So, as we're screening participants and screening, we're having the conversation: are you willing to come in 3 times a week for X amount of period to do the clinical trial? You hope that outcomes, right, that as they're engaging in the intervention, that they're seeing some level of outcome that makes them motivated to want to engage. I will say different for us too is we don't necessarily see ourselves as a behavior change or behavior modification company. I mean, we are using music to directly stimulate the brain to change an outcome functionally. So we hope that change is evident. So that's engaging. And then, we always feel that compensating and lowering barriers to people, whether that's transportation costs or whatever that might be, but compensation is important in principle to give people as they come in, but ensuring that that's not the motivating factor as well. But I think, as I said, James and Yusuf, I think, have a better perspective here.
Awesome. Yeah, totally agree on all points. The compensation cannot be too excessive, and IRBs will usually advise on this. So if you do have a compensation plan, that would be something that the IRB that you select would look at closely, and they probably advise to keep that in a reasonable range. But you do need to also compensate people for, the friction that comes with clinical research. They do have to present to doctors' offices. They do need to submit extra surveys, submit data. So compensate people for the inconvenience, but certainly motivate them for the right reasons. Also a great reason to do a feasibility study. If you are planning to just dive right into a multi-100 patient study that might be for FDA submission, it'd be really good to know the engagement strategies, the drop-off rates in advance, because you're going to need to have a complete statistics plan as you go into that, and to know exactly the drop-off rate to be able to plan accordingly would be really, really valuable. So a good reason to run a feasibility. This is actually pretty related to another topic, as many of digital therapy trials and trials that do have at-home components will include a lot of steps that need to be done by the patient, sort of asking quite a bit of them often with respect to wearables, survey collection. There's often take-home kits like spit kits, test kits, microbiome, stool collection kits, et cetera. For each of these, I mean, have you noticed any participant friction, any opportunities or challenges with getting patients to fulfill their responsibilities as a patient, particularly with respect to the actual procedures that they need to perform at home?
Yeah, I might actually speak to mobile phlebotomy real quick in this context. So obviously the last few months have been really unique, right? And so, initially we were having folks come into, their primary care physician or to a cardiovascular center for their blood draw. And then suddenly, in a world affected by COVID, folks are a little bit more scared or hesitant to, make their way into a physician's office or a hospital. So one of the things that worked really well for us was actually, partnering with the Curebase team in deploying a mobile phlebotomy option, essentially for our subjects. And so what that means is that, we have partnered with a company that can actually send folks into the home in almost all 50 states and essentially collect, blood draws on a one-on-one basis. This really goes back to what Yusuf said about spending your time thoroughly on the research design piece, because that obviously adds a high level of complexity and an additional level. But for us, it was something that we were interested in because, we can see steps data, we can see engagement data from just our app users on a day-to-day basis. But one of the things we can't get access to normally is things like cholesterol. And so being able to do the blood draw through a more flexible data collection perspective was really helpful for us.
Yeah, I think the rule of thumb over here is where it's not directly related to the intervention itself, do everything you can to minimize friction around data collection. So mobile phlebotomy is great if you need a blood draw, but also kind of sometimes there's this want to collect data for the sake of collecting data, which can often lead to endless surveys and kind of readings of kind of biomarkers or whatever. And where possible, you want to refrain from that. You only want to collect things that apply to your primary outcome and like a reasonable number of secondary outcomes. And then you want to really reduce all friction as much as possible. And often kind of like biomarkers are part of your intervention. So in our case, we made carbon monoxide testing as part of the actual Quick Genius program. And then we kind of really designed a seamless user experience and member experience where people could easily collect carbon monoxide sensor through a connected device, and that would be kind of sent directly to us, and they didn't have to re-input that value anywhere else or kind of anything like that. So there's kind of a lot of work that can often be done just to remove friction, make sure they're reporting to a single system, and then you're aligning the data to make sure that it kind of fits and matches. So yeah, the rule of thumb is just make things easy where it's not part of the intervention itself.
And it becomes an interesting question too, as you think about this, is the collection of data from the product itself. That's more than just adherence or engagement data. For example, we have clinical grade biomechanical sensors that people wear as they walk in, they deliver the intervention. Our primary endpoints are speed and biomechanics. So we're actually capturing all of that in real time. We know how that goes, but then the strategic question comes, should that be the endpoint collected by our own product? Is there any risk of doing that? And the really interesting question becomes, if those are your primary endpoints, being gait speed, biomechanics, et cetera, particularly in the world of COVID, if they're not coming from your own product, how do you capture them? Right? So is there a trade-off of using a different product or using an in-person or some sort of hybrid model that extends time and capital versus collecting it all with your product? And I think the answer to that too, when you think strategically, is also, who is this going to be used for? If this is an early feasibility study, we would likely say that's probably much more acceptable. If this becomes more of a pivotal trial, maybe that's not accepted. And that's why you'd want to talk to your customer, I would say, or whoever's going to be consuming the data of your trial to say, would this be a valid endpoint? I don't think that that's necessarily a black and white answer of is this a valid endpoint or not. But also, I like this question of, are self-reported outcomes reliable? I think self-reported outcomes in healthcare are some of the most important data that we can collect as companies, regardless of what our organizations do. Understanding their perceptions of change is crucial. But that's what I got.
Awesome. Agree with all those. A couple learnings from our side, just on the engagement piece. Using folks who actually can pick up the phone and communicate with the patients is often very effective. Sort of a virtual research coordinator is a technique and a staff that we maintain at Curebase. So if you're monitoring patients for their engagement, if you're seeing that they're having any difficulties with certain steps, maybe it's a data submission, maybe it's the use of a wearable, you can pick up the phone and call them. And especially for less tech savvy population, that's super effective. Another one is to reduce the number of places you put input in. So, one of the benefits with digital products is they often are modern web platforms that have APIs. So if your ePro, if your data collection solutions, if your EDC have the ability to integrate with modern APIs, which is something that we embrace, then you can actually start to really streamline the patient's process and also get a better view of how to monitor them. So embrace integrating the data if you have the capability to do so. This question was actually asked by Jason, and part of it was also related to bias, which I thought was a really interesting place to take it. I think that when it comes to digital therapy trials, you have a lot of considerations to make when deciding who the patient population is going to be. And there are sometimes opportunities to bias for different populations where they recruited more through social media or more through physician referrals. Are they elderly, or are they in different demographics? Are they more or less tech savvy? I'm curious, when you were planning your studies, or are they from your user base, or are they folks who are completely new to your product and don't actually know what it is? So with those considerations, how did you go about deciding your patient population, and what efforts did you take to ensure diversity and a prevention of bias?
Yeah, I think this is really key, and what you're really trying to do is ensure that your clinical trial is as real world as possible. So the same group that's going to be or using your product on a regular basis is kind of adequately mirrored in your study group. Like the worst thing is, and because like from a peer review standpoint, when you publish this data, you're going to have to report on what the demographics actually look like. So the worst thing is when you kind of have this great study, but it's in a totally unrepresentative population. And that doesn't necessarily tell you as to what the actual population will look like. And sometimes that actually does come down to the fact that the recruiting sources are going to be quite different for a clinical trial versus maybe for a customer group. So it's one of the things I think to be mindful of as to how to prevent it. I think it's just around ensuring that your recruitment sources are as diverse as possible and mirror the general population. So where possible, I mean, if most of the kind of users or most of the customers are in a certain country or a certain geography or location, you generally want to do the clinical trial in that location. There's no point kind of doing it in a totally different location with different group of customers. So, and that's some of the easy things you can do. And then just generally making sure that you're adequately collecting data on what the demographics actually look like. And then just assessing that whether or not this matches what the customer demographics look like if you have that data available.
And I think, as you look at, there's lots of different types of diversity that we would want to look at. I mean, number one being geographical diversity, right? So as we think about neuroinjury or disease, we certainly know that certain diseases are more prevalent in certain geographies. And looking at diversity of race, of age, of background is important because you're building this product for hopefully a global use. And also thinking about, I would say, diversity across age levels, and I think socioeconomic status is really important too, to give us really true feedback on what we're trying to accomplish. That one I think is more challenging to find, because how do you recruit those subjects? How do you get access to those subjects? I always am very mindful and very skeptical when I talk to PIs and they tell me, oh, I've got this person who's been in 3 other of our trials who's really excited about this trial. While that's wonderful, great, we got one subject coming in. If those are the people that we're recruiting, are we really getting a true vision or a true insight into what the product can do in the wild? And so I think that that's a crucial part of designing the clinical trials, to ensure that you can somehow capture as wide of a blanket as possible.
Totally. And on a practical level, you can actually put that in your statistics plan and in your protocol. So you can define certain caps for the different groups. If you want to say we won't enroll more than 30 or 40% males or females, you can absolutely write that down and enforce that. If you want to create an enrollment cap for each of your sites, let's say you're recruiting out of 5, 6, 7 sites, you can say that no site will recruit more than 40. And you could do that for the recruitment channel as well. You can say no more than 50 patients will be referred by Facebook or by another form of advertisement, Instagram, whatever it is. So you can enforce that, and it's probably certainly something you would want to think about up front to really formalize the types of diversity you want. There are a couple questions that came up about informed consent. I'd love to know how you folks performed informed consent in your studies, what that looked like, and particularly how you made sure that patients really understood their obligations in the study, understood what the purpose of the research was, still maintained the blind, and did so in a way that was really ethical for the patients.
Yeah, just to briefly chime in here, I think us using Curebase's platform for consent was really helpful because it really cuts down on the amount of work for the physician involved in here as well. Once you start getting physicians involved with a study, of course, one of the questions they're going to come up with is how much time is this going to take me? I've already got a full slate of patients all day long, and now you want to add another responsibility to my day to have to explain the study and then also have to get their consent. I mean, that's a huge ask for most physicians, especially good ones, right? So anything that you can do to make it as easy as possible. Hey, look, all of our consents are going to be electronic. You can have the patient sign the consent or review it before even coming into the clinic. It's a huge help in terms of greasing the wheels with making sure that the physicians are on board with that as well. That way, the physician can spend more of their time talking about why this study is important and, and what are the aims of the study. So that's what we found worked really well for us.
Our trials have really been much more traditional trials, in-clinic trials, so with partnering with academic medical centers and research organizations. So our informed consent process is, I would say, a pretty standard process. So I would lean on Yusuf and James for that.
Yeah, and we did in-person consent as well because we had a baseline visit when people actually were consented and then randomized. I think generally just doing this, digitally being able to kind of capture all that information is really important. I would also say just the learning we had is also making sure you have paper copies of consent forms as backups as well. Seems simple, but occasionally things go wrong, and you want to make sure you're capturing all the data and making the best use of the time over there. But otherwise, it's I think as generally an IRB group is going to really go through your consent form, make sure it has an adequate amount of information, and in layman's terms, you're really explaining exactly what the study involves, any adverse side effects, all those different things. So there's usually a lot of thought that goes into that, and you probably want to kind of do this at the initiation phase when you're putting your study protocol together and other documentation.
Absolutely. And the consent contains a lot more than just the basics of collecting a signature and indicating that you understand the basics of the study. The more the patient can understand, especially if this is a long-running study that's going to require their engagement for weeks, the more adherence you're going to have, the more engagement. So the consent can actually be an opportunity to really drive an understanding that's going to make them better participants, not just to meet the ethical and regulatory requirement. One thing that's come up for us a lot, and it's a good use case for the virtual remote consent as well, even if you do an in-person, formal consent is reconsenting. If your study is many weeks long, you'll probably modify the protocol. At some point, you might adjust some of the study activities, you might adjust some aspects of the compensation or something else. So to be able to reconsent folks remotely and again, continue to build their understanding of the clinical trial, their understanding of their expectations, it's just one more tool to make sure that they're really high quality participants. And even if you do the in-person baseline, that remote reconsenting can be really, really powerful. We only have 2 minutes, but I saw one very interesting question, which we'll wrap up on. This one comes from Madeline, and it's actually about what patients are allowed to see about all the data that's collected. And this has come up for us quite a bit. Many of our studies at Curebase involve, somewhat often expensive forms of new biospecimen collection, analysis, lots of data tracking, shipping patients biometric devices. Are they allowed to see that data during the trial? Are they allowed to look at it afterwards? Can you provide patients sort of who are interested in learning more about their health that supplemental benefit of being in the trial, which is that they get to learn more about their own health, wellness, and how they did in the trial and what their data was? I guess framed another way, are patients allowed to see their clinical results, or would that be something that could perhaps interfere with the statistics of the study?
In our case, they're not, especially during this study, they're not able to see their own data and their own clinical outcomes while they're in the study. I don't know about James or Youssef, but
for the FDA path, that certainly makes the most sense.
Correct. Yeah, in our case, it's clearly labeled, I mean, a smoking cessation study, and they're usually fairly aware. So it doesn't really kind of apply so much in our case, in that there's any sort of like hidden clinical outcomes that we're able to show them. And part of the intervention is really kind of showing insights kind of back to them. But again, that only applies in the treatment arm, where people have the program that actually surfaces a lot of those insights. So I'd say it probably doesn't apply too much to us.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well,
no, go ahead, Tom.
We're at time, unfortunately. So Jason, should we continue or should we wrap it up? I think since we're at the top of the hour, we'll be respectful of folks' time and wrap it up. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, James. Thank you, Youssef, for joining us. I think it's been a really great conversation. Thank you to the audience for asking so many awesome questions and making this, a collaborative session. If you do have follow-up questions, you can reach out to Curebase at hello@curebase.com, and we'll be happy to spend more time answering any specific questions about digital therapy trials or about decentralized trials that you might have. So thanks for coming. We really appreciate it. And yeah, feel free to follow up at hello@curebase.com.